Magnus begins with the English opening by playing pawn to c4, and Vichy mirrors it with pawn to c5. It's like both are saying, let's keep it balanced and see who makes the first move. Magnus fianchettos his bishop with pawn to g3, setting up a strong diagonal. Vichy develops his knight to c6, preparing to challenge the center. Both are setting up their pieces, but keeping their plans hidden for now. Magnus places his bishop on g2, ready to fire from long range. Vichy, not falling behind, also fianchettos his bishop with pawn to g6. It's like both sides are preparing for a diagonal battle. Magnus develops his knight to c3, adding more control to the center. Vichy places his bishop on g7, keeping up with Magnus. It almost looks like a well-rehearsed dance. Magnus quietly plays pawn to d3, making his position solid. Vichy matches with pawn to d6. No major attacks yet. Both players are carefully setting the stage for what's to come. Magnus develops his queen to d2, possibly planning to castle queenside. Vichy moves his knight to f6, aiming at the e4 square. All pieces are ready and waiting for the action to begin. Magnus plays pawn to b3, preparing to fianchetto his other bishop. Vichy castles kingside, securing his king. The opening phase is almost done, and it's time for the real game to start. Magnus completes his double fianchetto with bishop to b2. Vichy develops his bishop to d7, connecting his rooks. Both sides are fully ready for the middle game. Magnus develops his knight to f3, putting more pressure on the center. Vichy places his rook on b8, showing his intention to play on the queen side. It's like Vichy is saying, Magnus, meet me on this side. Magnus castles kingside, finishing his development. Vichy pushes pawn to s6, preparing for a pawn storm. Things are heating up, and it's about to get exciting. Magnus jumps his knight to d5, taking control of a strong square. Vichy immediately pushes pawn to a6, forcing the knight to move back. It's like saying, get off my lawn. Magnus trades his knight for Vichy's knight on f6. Vichy recaptures with his bishop, keeping his structure intact. Magnus opens up the center with pawn to d4. Vichy responds on the queen side with pawn to b5. Both sides are saying attack is the best defense. Magnus captures the pawn on c5, but Vichy counters by taking the pawn on b2 with his bishop. A classic, you take mine, I take yours moment. Magnus retakes the b2 pawn with his queen, and Vichy reinforces his position by recapturing on c5 with his pawn. Both sides are building pressure. Magnus activates his rook with rook to c1, targeting the open file. Vichy pushes pawn to c4, creating a passed pawn. The queen side is now a battlefield. Magnus captures with pawn to bxc4, but Vichy immediately recaptures. It's like a tug of war with no clear winner yet. Magnus places his queen on c3, eyeing the queenside pawns. Vichy tries to break the center open with pawn to e5. The strategies are clashing now. Magnus grabs another pawn with queen to c4, gaining a slight advantage. Vichy moves his queen to a7, preparing for counterplay on the kingside. Magnus pushes pawn to h4, hinting at a kingside attack. Vichy doubles his rooks with rook to c8, focusing on the open file. Magnus plays queen to e4, putting pressure on Vichy's position. Vichy responds with bishop to f5, challenging the queen's influence. The board is tense. Magnus retreats his queen to e3, keeping his position flexible. Vichy boldly pushes pawn to e4, trying to break through. But Magnus is ready. Magnus jumps his knight to g5, targeting the weak squares near Vichy's king. Vichy counters by placing his knight on b4, threatening c2, but Magnus stays calm. Magnus trades rooks with rook takes on c8. Vichy recaptures, but the open file now belongs to Magnus. Magnus sacrifices his bishop on e4. What a brilliant move, swinging open lines against Vichy's king. Vichy's knight jumps to c2, threatening forks, but Magnus neutralizes the threat. Magnus captures the knight with bishop takes on c2, and Vichy responds by taking on e3 with his queen. But by now Magnus is miles ahead. Magnus calmly recaptures with pawn to fxe3. Vichy activates his rook with rook to c2, desperately searching for counterplay. Magnus calmly moves his king to f1. Vichy retreats his bishop to c8, trying to find a better diagonal. Magnus jumps his knight to f3, coordinating it with his rooks. Vichy moves his bishop to a6, eyeing some activity on the queen side, but Magnus is already a step ahead. Magnus brings his knight to d4, attacking black's weak pawns and dominating the center. Vichy activates his rook to c3, desperately trying to create counterplay. Magnus moves his king to f2, Vishy plays rook to a3. Magnus places his knight on c2, ready to support his pawns. Vishy's rook shuffles to a4. Magnus pushes pawn to a3, strengthening his queenside. Vishy retreats his bishop to b7, but it's stuck in defense mode. Magnus calmly brings his knight to b4, completely locking down the queenside. Vishy shuffles his king to g7, trying to improve his position. Magnus moves his knight to d3. Vishy tries rook to a5, but it feels like a waiting move. Magnus activates his rook to b1, lining it up for action. Vishy plays bishop to d5, attempting to create counterplay, but Magnus is in full control. Magnus shifts his rook to a1, fully dominating the board. Vishy responds with bishop to e4. Magnus repositions his knight to b2, preparing to push his pawns. Vishy moves his king to h6. The king is so far out of position, it might need a GPS to find its way back. Magnus moves his knight to c4, tightening the noose. Vishy retreats his rook to a6, trying to defend, but Magnus has all the winning chances. Magnus pushes pawn to f4, advancing his passed pawn. Vishy shuffles his king to h5, but it's just delaying the inevitable. Magnus brings his knight to d2, adding more pressure. Vishy plays rook to f6, hoping for counterplay, but Magnus isn't fazed. Magnus calmly places his knight on f3, defending everything. Vishy's king advances to g4, but it's walking straight into trouble. Magnus pushes the pawn to a5, and Vishy resigns. The passed pawn is unstoppable and there's no coming back. What a dominating performance by Magnus. Wow! If you like this chess commentary, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and comment down on which topic I made new video. See you in the next game.